Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern, and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Torah portion is Vayeshev. Joseph is the first and only biblical personality characterized as a success. With a nod to Max Weber, who was one of the first sociologists who looked at religion's effect on economic behavior, we take this opportunity to explore the biblical and later rabbinic definition of financial and other success. So join us for Joseph and the Spirit of Capitalism. Well, welcome back to Madlik, and we are in an amazing portion. We were talking about before the amount of stories. We're in a real transition. Joseph is comes onto the stage. He's put in a pit. He's parlayed into a slave. Goes to Egypt, and as they say, the rest is history. It's a real transition. You don't know if he's a model of the Jewish people going down into Egypt, or the actual actor who brings them down. That is all fascinating. But I am going to focus today on just two verses, as I said in the intro, that refer to Joseph in a fascinating way. In Genesis 39, 2-3, it says, God was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. Vayihi Hashem et Yosef, vayihi ish matzliach. And he stayed in the house of his Egyptian master. And when his master saw that God was with him, and that God lent success to everything he undertook, v'chol asher hu asa, Hashem matzliach biyado. So for the first time, not only is Joseph considered a winner, a successful person, but it's apparent through his success that God must be with him. And moving forward into later stories, if you recall when Joseph is in jail, again, the chief jailer did not supervise anything that was in Joseph's charge, it says in Genesis 39, because God was with him, and whatever he did, God made successful. Hashem ito v'asher hu asa, Hashem matzliach. Now, it's not that the word hatzlacha, success, hasn't been used before, but prior, it's all with Eliezer, by the way, the servant of Abraham. It wasn't he that was successful, it was his deeds, what he was doing. So in Genesis 24, it says, the man meanwhile stood looking at her, silently wonder whether God had made his errand successful or not. Hatzlicha Hashem darko. Hatzliach darkecha, a successful path, a successful action is mentioned 5 times with Eliezer. But here we have the first time it's mentioned about a person. Rabbi, do you think it's significant?
Well, first of all, that's a great little point that you make. That's not a small point. That about Joseph, it's always about the person. It's always about Joseph. Joseph is bigger than life. Joseph is good looking. Joseph is successful. Not his actions. It's always about Joseph. Eliezer, the servant, when you're a servant, it's never about you. It's about what you do. That's a very, very, very important point. Now, that's what gets Joseph in trouble, by the way. It's all about Joseph. So therefore, the wife of Potiphar keeps his eye on him, and then he gets sent to prison. So being that it's always about Joseph is not always so good, but your point that you make is a very, very good point.
And it's not that we haven't had success, even if the word hasn't been used before. Abraham was considered greatly successful, and it's not as though that success has not reflected on God as the source of the success. God promised Abraham that he would bless him with riches and children, and sure enough, he did. But the point is, and I think this is critical, is that with Abraham, he was promised success from God. And, he goes down to Egypt with his wife. He says, she's my sister. Turns out she wasn't. The Pharaoh is embarrassed, gives him riches. He benefited by being blessed by God. I think what you're seeing with Joseph is a slight, nuanced, but ultimately critical paradigm shift. Because Joseph was successful, people saw the hand of God. I think that's different.
Yeah, there's no question that is different. So you're making a double point. One is the difference between Joseph being successful and Eliezer's actions being successful. Then what's the outcome of Joseph's being successful? That's a second point.
Yes. And so I think also I started by making the comparison to Max Weber, who wrote this amazing book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And he was a sociologist, but he believed that religious outlook could be responsible by how you engage in the economics. And what I see here is when we look at Joseph, you can't but say that what he was successful at was material, mercurial things. He arrives, he's hired by Potiphar, who happens to be the Tsar of Shchita. He was the slaughterhouse king, and he arranges his house, and he makes him successful. We're not talking about spiritual, we're not talking about artistic success. We are definitely talking about a slave who has nothing by definition. He doesn't control his own life, and he then shines by whoever he touches, whether it's his first master, whether it's his cellmate, whether ultimately it's Pharaoh and the whole of Egypt. He makes material success, and through that they see, or at least the Bible sees, God, and believes that others see God through that. And I think that is, in fact, a profound statement of a religion. Is it not?
I think that is a very good, really good point. Through that to see God, that's really what we're looking for always. Through people's actions, that people should be able to see God. Because the problem always is, how do you see God? Right? You can't see God directly, so you can only see God through human action.
But it's a particular type of action. It's economic success.
But isn't that interesting, right? But it has to be through human action. It can't be just seeing God. That doesn't mean anything.
Yes. And to play devil's advocate, to drive the point home that this doesn't need to be the case and that it should, in fact, surprise us or at least put us at the edge of our chair, I could be quoting from the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Essenes, but I'll quote the more popular, famous source for that theology, which is the New Testament. And in the New Testament, it says in Matthew, "Truly I tell you, it is hard for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God." We know about them that the early Christians were very similar to the Essenes. Sell your possessions and give to the poor, they are commanded. They had everything in common. This literally comes out of what we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls about the Essenes. They sold property and possessions to give to everyone who had need. And finally, that there were no needy persons among them. Their paradigm was, you can call it, if you have to tag it with a modern term, socialism, but their paradigm was that there should be communal ownership, that we should get rid of poverty. And that would not actually see success of God in someone who made it in the economy. We said before, even in the Sermon on the Mount, it says, "Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." So it's not a knee-jerk that this is the case. I do think it requires some further evaluation if, in fact, I'm reading something into the text, or in fact, this is saying that at least there's a strong thread in the Joseph story that success means right. Success means touched by the hand of God.
Well, it does. I mean, let's just take a second. You quoted the New Testament, and you suggested correctly that the some of the other groups during the Second Temple believed in poverty. You have to remember that the ruling class in Jerusalem, the Jewish ruling class in Jerusalem, they were called the Sadducees. And they were Kohanim, they were priests, but they were also wealthy. You know, in those days, everybody brought their gifts to the priests because they thought the priests then would pray for them and then they would be successful. So the priests amassed a huge amount of wealth. So if you were a group that was battling with the priests, and I'm talking battling in terms of socially battling with the priests, you tended to reject wealth because that's what these people stood for, or at least that's the way they were seen. So the Essenes, or the Dead Sea sect, moved out of Jerusalem. They lived in the Judean mountains, and literally they lived in poverty to show that wealth was not the answer. The early Christians, the Sermon on the Mount, the early Christians, they also were big believers in the fact that that money was bad, right? Money was problematic, because they were fighting against the establishment. So that was interesting. Now, what's really interesting is that after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, the Sadducees and the priests lost because there's no temple. The priests have no significance. So even within kind of standard Judaism, traditional Judaism, the Pharisees, who were the rabbis, who were not the wealthy class, the regular people, they also were victorious. So therefore, the idea of not being rich, of fighting the rich, was something that was very much an end of the Second Temple period. That was when that was familiar.
There's a philosophy behind it. I mentioned a second ago that one of the aims of the New Testament, and we might say by that the aim of the communal societies built in the Dead Sea, was to eradicate poverty. And we have in the Torah itself, when it talks about the rules of lending on interest, when it talks about the issue of supporting those who don't have it, it says in a very powerful verse in Deuteronomy, there will always be poor in the land. And this actually was the source of a confrontation, of a discussion that is captured in the Talmud. In Baba Batra 10a, it has this amazing dialogue between Rabbi Akiva and Turnus Rufus, a famous Roman. And he asks him the following question. And he says, if God loves the poor, for what reason does he not support them? And Akiva said to him, so that through them we will be saved from the judgment of Gehenna. In truly Jewish fashion, Tikkun Olam fashion, Akiva says, well, God gave us the poor so that we could get the mitzvah of taking care of the poor. But Rufus is not finished yet. He says, no, let me tell you a parable, almost in like New Testament model. He says, let's say that the king put away someone who he was angry at. He made him a slave, and he put him in prison, and he ordered that he should not be fed or given drink. And one person went ahead and fed him and gave him to drink. If the king heard about this, would he not be angry with that person? In other words, what he's asking is, and this will pick up in Weber and the Protestants, where if you are poor, the flip side of being blessed when you are rich is that you must have done something wrong and you must be cursed if you are poor. And therefore, you are trivialing with God's order if you engage in that wonderful Jewish biblical dynamic of tzedakah, of interest-free loans? That is literally the question that he's posing to Akiva. If God wanted people to have money, he would have given it to them. You are playing God. You are playing in this field. And that's the question that he asks. And of course, Akiva gives him a wonderful answer and says, first of all, the Jewish people are not slaves, we're children. And if it was a child who the king had put in prison, I won't get into the answer. You can figure it out. But what I loved is that the Talmud captures this schism, this dialogue, this dialectic between two totally opposite approaches to the power of the economy to raise up those who don't have, the power of the economy to favor those who have it. It really is fascinating, isn't it?
Absolutely fascinating. The idea of power, the idea of being connected to people with power. See, there are actually two things. You know, they always say it's good to have wealth or it's good to have power. And if you can't have power, you should be connected to someone who has power or wealth, right? So that's really what that story's about. You know, do you have the power yourself or you're connected to somebody with power? So that's interesting when you get back to the Joseph story, is that Joseph himself is all of these things, but actually he's not any of these things because he's a nobody. He's a slave. The reason he's successful is because he somehow, by chance, gets purchased by Potiphar. Then he goes to jail and he's a nobody. But somehow the Sar Hamashkim remembers him. And then he goes in front of Pharaoh. That's crazy. This slave goes in front of Pharaoh. How can that possibly be? And he becomes viceroy over Egypt. So sometimes it's not who you are, but how you're connected to that person.
Well, I mean, you could easily make the case that he is the personification of the entrepreneur who pulls himself up from his own bootstraps. Again, I'm using economic terms, but here's somebody who is not part of the right caste. He's not part of the right guild. He literally is designed to be someone who's pulled from the pit, and he is a prototype. He is a paradigm of being blessed by God, and he is a role model because of it. Like I said, there doesn't appear again in the whole Torah the word ish matzliach, a successful man. It's kind of fascinating.
That is a fascinating point. And the fact that the word matzliach is used elsewhere, but it's used in a different context, that makes your point even stronger.
So we've talked a little bit about this challenge to economic theory of how do you deal with the have-nots? Are they cursed, or are they responsible of enlightened capitalism to bring up? But this other thing about are they responsible because they're cursed by God, or are they our responsibility as part of the organic and the invisible hand of the economy? So in Proverbs 13, which by the way is wisdom literature, so it could appear it's not Torah in the sense that it really contains the real Jewish covenant and all that, but it says, poverty and humiliation are for him who spurns discipline, but he who takes reproof to heart gets honor. So there is this sense of the old Franklin adage, you got to wake up in the morning, early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Weber quotes Franklin all the time as the prototype of the Protestant capitalist, and for good reason, because coming right out of the common sense approach of wisdom literature, which we have also, it's this double-edged sword. On the one hand, having wealth, making something is blessed. And on the other hand, it's the responsibility of those who have to support the have-nots. But on the other hand, there's not a way out. You need discipline. We all have to be responsible for making a living. So I think one of the lessons that we're going to come out of tonight is that in the Jewish rabbinic biblical tradition, it's not black and white. It's a mixed bag. And in that sense, I think that it's not pure capitalism, but maybe one could call it enlightened or modified capitalism.
Okay, I think that's fair. I mean, you're putting nuance into it, and I think that's only the right thing to do because the Torah doesn't know about capitalism the way we talk about capitalism in the 21st century. And I think that's an important point to make. Means we talk about Ish Matzliach, but the jump from Ish Matzliach to Weber is not a direct jump. I think that's an important point to make.
So we're going to get a little bit more into Weber in a second, but he had a cohort because Weber really, maybe he was a self-hating Jew, but he gave the Protestants all the credit for launching capitalism, a free market economy, a wage economy. What he referred to in terms of the biblical economy, he gave it a name that he called it pariah capitalism. And of course, he was using the old adage of the Jew is not a producer. He's a middleman. He's a trader. He doesn't actually contribute to society. And the fascinating thing about our parsha is that we do have this little side story of Yehuda and Tamar. And in it, it says something kind of fascinating. It says, there Yehuda saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shu'ah, and he took her as his wife and cohabited with her. Rashi says, Canaanite means a merchant. The Jews, the Israelites who were the landed gentry in the Promised Land and had displaced the Canaanites and made them into the pariahs, referred to them almost in a derogatory way as merchants. For those of you who have ever heard the wonderful, beautiful song, A Woman of Valor, that we sing every Friday night, in it we say, Sadin asta v'timkor v'chagor natna leknani, that the woman of value makes cloth and sells it and offers a girdle, and now I'm using the English translation, to the merchant. So literally, the Kanaani was considered by the lander Jews as the merchant. This is a time-honored tradition in putting down the trader as not being productive. And that kind of struck me too. Just a fascinating aside, but maybe not so much an aside, because clearly Jewish finance and Jewish working of markets and arbitrage has added a lot of value, but it has always been an Achilles heel.
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, you're kind of pulling all the different things together, but of course it's all true. And I think that, that's an interesting thing to do that and to understand that this idea of being an Ish, I mean, let's say it like this. Let's say it as a Dvar Torah. Being an Ish Matzliach is a marker that has identified Jews throughout the centuries. And it's identified Jews in different ways. Sometimes, it's a compliment. They say Koreans want to learn Hebrew because they want to be like the Jews, because they see the Jews are so successful, they want to be like the Jews. Ish Matzliach, they want to be an Ish Matzliach. But at the same time, many anti-Semites use the fact that we're an Ish Matzliach, that we do something wrong to be an Ish Matzliach. So it's so interesting that way of identifying Jews is something that's followed us throughout the centuries, both for good and for bad.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to quote this Werner Sombart, who died in 1941. He argued that Jewish traders and manufacturers excluded from the guilds developed a distinctive antipathy to the fundamentals of medieval commerce, which they saw as a primitive and unprogressive, the desire for just and fixed wages and prices, for an equitable system in which shares of the market were agreed upon exchanging. He uses this Kanaani. He uses this merchant class as literally the source of capitalism. But what's fascinating is, if we just stop back at the comment you just made in terms of Ish Matzliach, if you listen to some of the barbs that are being thrown at the Jewish people, call it, they run Hollywood, they run this. It's almost as though success is considered a crime. It really takes the argument very much back to this biblical sense that we're talking about. Is it something that means that we should be proud of? If you remember, Rabbi, when we had my friend the minister on, and we were talking about, and I said to him, what is the challenge of the successful Jew? And he said, I love it when my Jewish brothers and sisters at the Seder lean to the side and take happiness with the fact that they were redeemed. They are proud of it. And he says that we African Americans have to be proud of what we've achieved. We were robbed of our culture. We were robbed of our gods. We were robbed of our names, and we became able to read in one generation. I love that, and I really think it sensitizes us to hatzlacha, success. Clearly, in Joseph's case and in the Bible's case, there is a very strong part of it that is considered something to be proud of and something touched by God. And I think that's a timely conversation.
That's a very timely conversation. By the way, you don't know how Joseph feels about being successful. It kind of goes to his head, and then he gets in trouble. So that idea that Ish Matzliach does well for Joseph, I think, is complicated.
So that's an amazing segue into Max Weber, because what Max Weber argues is that what really launched Protestantism, Calvinism in particular, as the source of American Western capitalism, was that when the Roman Catholic Church was involved, it was in charge of salvation, and everybody knew where they stood. But once it was rejected, they looked for other signs that they were saved. And Calvin and his followers taught a doctrine of double predestination, in which from the beginning God chose some people for salvation and others for damnation. And they translated that into believe that one who's chosen for salvation is successful. And they really, you read it and you start to see echoes of modern day thought, of the argument against welfare, where they literally, as Rufus said, that those who work hard should not give their money to prop up those who don't have. It's really kind of fascinating. But to your point of Joseph having trouble with retaining his equanimity and retaining his happiness in life, he goes so far to talk about the humility and the asceticism of the real capitalists. We are kind of in this sense of reinvesting and cumulative interest, where you don't spend your money on luxury, where you don't stop working. Everything is the opportunity cost. If I'm not working, I'm losing money. And that ultimately, Weber points out how then it became almost an idolatry. So it goes the whole 9 yards, so to speak. But it's a fascinating insight to me. The amount that a theology, that a religion can affect something as basic as how we do economics, and how we control and are affected by markets. That I thought was absolutely fascinating.
I mean, it is fascinating, but so much of religion depends on economics. It means how you give a sacrifice. You know, who had animals to give as sacrifices? Probably not very many people. The Torah actually has a sliding scale for sacrifices. Depending on how wealthy you are, either you gave an animal, or you were able to give birds, or even you were able to give a meal offering. Isn't that an interesting thing when you talk about wealth and you talk about economy? Isn't a sliding scale for sacrifices something that's amazing? Now, I never did research on this. I don't know whether other religions had a sliding scale, but I would imagine that they did. Because if you don't have a sliding scale for sacrifices, you can never have sacrifices because nobody could afford it.
And at the end of the day, you got to be able to pay your bills, and you got to.
That's correct, right? I mean that's a big part of it.
So we've quoted from philosophers, sociologists, from the New Testament, the Old Testament, but I think we have to go to the ultimate golden source. And of course, there is no more golden source than Fiddler on the Roof and If I Want to Be a Rich Man. And so in that song, reading from the lyrics, I really do believe it captures some real essences of the Jewish approach. And it says, I realize, of course, it's no shame to be poor, but it's no great honor either. And he goes, if I was a rich man, he says, I would be able to pose problems that would cross a rabbi's eye. And it won't make one difference if I answer right or wrong. When you're rich, they think you really know. If I were rich, I'd have the time that I lack to sit in the synagogue and pray, and maybe have a seat by the Eastern Wall. And I discuss the holy books with the learned men several hours every day, and that would be the sweetest thing of all. I really think he touches on so many
points. He captures it, right?
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. And I think the key takeaway that I always took from that, we can have another discussion on the fact that a wealthy person somehow got to the point where no matter what he says, the rabbis consider right or wrong. I think that gets back to who pays for the sacrifices that you talked about a second ago. But I think what really rings true is this bond, this contract that was made between having money and having the time to learn. And that gets back to something very basic, this Yissachar and Zvulun contract, where one tribe was seafaring and worked and the other studied. But there always had to be someone to pay the bills. And, in getting really local to Israel now, when you have people studying and they can't pay the bills, or when you have a society that only focuses on the study, they have to remember im ein derech eretz ein Torah, im ein kemach ein Torah. And these are part of it. It is a full economic system, and I think it really does affect the Jewish success story in a profound way, and someone needs to write the book, Joseph and the Spirit of Capitalism, because it really is a very strong, I think, profound impact that the Jews have made, that it's made on us and that we have made on the world.
Fantastic. I'm looking forward to the book. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. This is a great discussion. Enjoy your Shabbos and enjoy your Hanukkah. Happy Hanukkah, everybody. We look forward next week to talking about Miketz and Hanukkah and a whole bunch of other things. Have a great week, everybody. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. All of you do not have a problem enjoying your Hanukkah gelt. It's okay. We Jews know how to handle money. Just turn to Yosef. So Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Rabbi, once again. We'll see you all next week. Have a lichtige Hanukkah, Hanukkah full of illumination and light. And look forward to seeing you all next week.